we've got 7 different paddocks that are about 7 or 8 acres each when you look at them. And one of the things how we manage this is it's a rotationally grazed system, and so we're trying to rotate them on a historic level. What we've done is we've had about 60 or 70 pair, and early on in the season when we have cow calves, of course you're trying to get them out there out of the mud as soon as you can. But what we do is in early spring when that grass is really growing, we're trying to stay ahead of it to keep it from getting mature. We leave them out there as a big group and maybe leave them out at each paddock for maybe 3-4 days to a week. And then what we do is as that growth curve starts to slow down in say June, about breeding season, because we breed for March calves, so about June, we split them up in half and we rotate half of them on the back half and the other half on the front half. And then we might ratchet down the time that they're out here. Instead of being out here for a week, they're out here maybe 2 or 3 days and we're rotating them. So you're same number of cattle, just different management on those acres to match up with the growing season. Okay. Now you'll notice, and I don't know if we'll end up getting clear back there, but a lot of our paddocks up towards the barns here, I mean they're in need of management just because it's easy to get them up and get them out of the mud. I mean, and so it gets a lot of traffic throughout the year, and we're quite frankly not very nice to them.
Calving pastures too, which get beat up.
So rather than have them up locked in the lot, we might turn them out into this south tower lot here, then bed them down really well and give them a little bit more space. And again, you keep the calves out of the mud, you keep them healthier, those sorts of things. But like I said, we're not very nice to these paddocks that are close to the buildings here. And then of course breeding season, if we do any AI, we're keeping cows up close as well. And so there's a lot of traffic on these closer paddocks here, probably in most need of management. The back ones stay fairly decent.
Right. Yeah. Yep. And this year actually we had more bull power, so we were able to split the group into 3s. We did that till about the middle of July. So we're actually, and we did have some timely rains in July, so it helped us keep the grass through the rest of the summer. But we were able to break it down into a third and keep cows in all separate and different paddocks. So I was able to save them. We got a little bit more time out of them in a paddock where we get 4 to 5 days on a normal basis. But yeah, so I mean that was really nice. I mean the rain obviously helped. The summer before it was really rough. We started haying cows in August and we didn't have any grass this time of year. So, but this is a far cry from where we were last year.
So, I think back to a couple years ago when we came out and visited. I think Megan kind of had a relationship and had been out on some projects and covered my projects and stuff, and so we talked a little bit, and we came out just to talk about, I think, pasture condition and some things we could maybe do to improve the overall condition and productivity of some pastures here, especially some of the closer up ones. And 2 years ago, I remember that day coming out, and especially these paddocks kind of just west of the dry lot and stuff were pretty mowed down, right? I mean, now that was a really dry season, and they hit on one of the challenges, I think, when you're dealing with, and this happens on all farms, but especially a community college teaching farm where we're going to bring students out and we're trying to kind of do some things actively. It's a lot easier to manage that when we keep the cattle relatively close, right? And so our buildings are here, our calving facilities are here, working facilities are here, and so it makes a lot of sense to me that it would be a challenge to manage the traffic and just the abuse that these pastures take when they're up close. And part of that, I think, to me just kind of speaks to the importance of recovery periods for pastures. Part of that whole rotational grazing thing that we talk about, one of the great advantages of that is maybe a little counterintuitive. It's not so much that we're getting to a fresh paddock every so often. It's actually the rest period as we're leaving a paddock. The rest period that we allow for that forage to kind of recover and rejuvenate a little bit really just lets it come back more quickly and be more productive for the season. And so we typically do promote some kind of rotational grazing. There's lots of ways to do that. And so like you guys were talking about, we can divide it into different groups of cattle. a lot of times if I'm giving advice where we're going from a continuously grazed pasture to, initial implementation of rotational grazing, a lot of times I really focus on just a couple cross fences to start with. And let's start with just 3 or 4 paddocks, maybe even just one cross fence going to 2 paddocks, as opposed to some of the more aggressive rotational grazing systems. We can get into systems where we're moving hot wires once or twice a day, right? And we're moving very, very frequently. But that can be kind of an adjustment for the producers. A lot of times it winds up being, for many producers, something that's not that much work. Doesn't take a lot of time each day, but it's a commitment that it has to be done each day if we get into that pattern. I think back, one of the things that we talked about a couple years ago when we first came out and we looked at it that fall, it was really mowed down. Almost reminded you of golf course, right, on some of that stuff. And we said this might be an opportunity to do some pasture renovation, because you're not going to have it probably more abused than it was at that time. And so sometimes then you think about, well, could you interseed, could you frost seed, could you incorporate legumes and those kinds of things? Because sometimes if you do that into a really well-established pasture that's doing really well, the sod that's already there outcompetes your new seeding, right? But then we also had to think about weed pressure and soil fertility and some different things like that. And so we really talked through some different ideas and different strategies for how to approach this. The one thing that I wanted to talk about just a little bit tonight with one of the handouts is the one that's called the Pasture Condition score sheet. And I don't know that we'll necessarily go through that point by point. And I guess it's up to you guys as to how much we want to actually go out and practice it and do like a hands-on, pasture condition score. But it's something that I like to point out, because I think it's easy when you get out to a pasture, it's very subjective, right? And it's easy to stand back and say, yeah, it looks pretty good, or yeah, it looks a little rough. But I think we need to dive in deeper and figure out like how to actually evaluate a pasture. And so this is something that actually is adapted from an NRCS worksheet. Okay, it's from an NRCS pasture condition score worksheet. A few years ago, for some pasture walks and pasture clinics, we tried to kind of simplify the NRCS's version of it. Okay, so this is a little different. It's a little simpler. So don't take this to your NRCS folks and tell them that you qualify for funding based on this score, because they'll get really grumpy with me. But the idea here is, for me, is simply to break it down and help you evaluate some different factors. And what I like about this is that it goes through, I think there's 9 or 10 different criteria here. So you can go out in the pasture and you can look at percent desirable plants. We can look at how much live plant cover there is, how much diversity there is. We can look at things like percent legume, okay? So most of the time in Iowa's cool season pastures, legume is a good thing. We can get some legume established, kind of a mixed pasture. It helps kind of support us through the summer slump when the cool seasons are kind of trying to go dormant. It can add some protein, it can add some quality throughout the grazing season. But it can be a little tough to manage, right? So weed control versus legume content is an issue sometimes. So it's really common to go out and see some weeds and think, man, we should just spray this, right? If you've got legume there established, you're going to spray and kill the legume as well. On the flip side, you can be thinking with a pasture that's pretty much predominantly cool season grass, hey, we'd like to incorporate some legume. Maybe you want to get weeds under control before you do that, right? Because you don't want to go ahead and seed a bunch of legume and then have to come back and spray and kill that a few years later. So there's kind of a juggling act or a balancing act there. Sometimes it comes up where people will ask about how much legume is desirable, with that whole idea that the legumes can cause bloat, right? So alfalfa, red clover, white clover, most of those legumes are bloating legumes. And so if the cattle ingest too much of that, proteins get broken down really quickly and they get this kind of frothy accumulation in the rumen, and it can build up and actually suffocate them and be deadly. Generally speaking, I would say if we're less than 50% legume, we're probably in pretty good shape. Ideally, I'd probably shoot for 30-35% legume in a pasture. I'd sleep really well at night feeling safe about that and know we've got some nitrogen fixation happening to support other grasses. I would know that we're supporting summer slump and we've got some good nutrients coming from that legume component. Now, interestingly, I would like that legume to be spread out relatively uniformly through the pasture. And one thing that comes up now and then is volunteer white clover will come up in pastures that are pretty stressed. Actually in some spots that are overgrazed. And maybe they're gonna come up along with some weeds. So that can sometimes be a tricky thing. There's different varieties of white clover that are maybe more productive than some of our small volunteer white clovers. And so that's something, you know, you want to be careful about maybe evaluating right here, the entrance to a pasture where it's been grazed down a little bit. Maybe we've had some traffic, you know, in and out of the pasture. If we saw some little volunteer white clover right here, we might think, wow, we got to be careful with the spray. I would encourage to go out deeper and look more thoroughly, look for other species, other varieties of clover, really get a bigger picture, if that makes sense.
So this is white clover, in case you'd like to look at it. So it's going to be hairless, right? Trifoliate leaves. Occasionally it'll have kind of a, we'll call it like a watermark on the leaves. But if this were red clover, it would have pubescence of hair along the stem. So is it seeded? Was it seeded or not?
Is that seeded?
White clover.
Well, based on where you got it from.
No.
It's volunteer.
Well, I mean, it was just a question whether you guys have seeded white clover.
Have a recommendation for weed control when you do have both grasses and then legumes out there? Is there a
No, the beef specialist does not have a recommendation.
So
it's a balance, right? So there are certain weed species, you know, they're not going to cause any harm to the livestock, right? In a lot of cases, cattle, horses, you know, we can get them to eat weeds, right? In some cases, there are toxicity issues that we need to be concerned about, depending on what weed it is. And in other cases, there are weeds that no matter what we do management-wise, we are probably never going to get rid of them without the use of a herbicide. And so a lot of it has to do with what kind of weeds you're dealing with, how spread out they are throughout the area, right? Is this something that we could control, you know, with just a little spot spray kind of application? I know you guys do a lot of spot spraying management out here. Or is it something where, you know, this pasture really does need kind of a broadcast application, and it's worth sacrificing whatever legume we have out here in order to take care of that weed issue, and then we can start bringing the legumes back afterward.
So that's a problem I ran into. I converted some bean stubble and I planted all of it grasses and legumes, and it rained for a month, and then all that came up was weeds, and then all my clover started coming up really good now. So I don't really know how to conquer weed because that'll kill it.
And some of it depends on what kinds of weeds they are, right? So like there's dandelion out here, right? We've got a lot of dandelion. Again, we're right at the entrance, so not a great spot to look, but there's a lot of dandelion. Over here, there's curly dock, right? These are not things that are likely to cause any harm. They are perennials though, so it's something that they'll keep coming back year after year. But then there's foxtail, right? And this year, I mean, there's a ton of foxtail in just about any pasture, and especially one that's newly established, I would expect to find it. And so if you got a good take on your grasses and your legumes, you should be able to crowd that foxtail out without any issue. The problem often comes in because this is there because there was an open space in the stand, which this spring when you seeded, of course, you would have had a perfect environment for it, and coming out of soybeans, there would have been a lot of foxtail. So the question is, will it be able to persist in an open area in the stand in future years? Because that means we probably have a more persistent issue, but oftentimes an annual species like this we can just take care of by promoting the health of the pasture species. So whether that's by fertilizing them appropriately or whether it's by maybe seeding something new in there to try and crowd it out.
So for example, what new can you seed in there with an already established cover?
Well, kind of the sky's the limit, honestly.
Well, I've been told that if you've got any alfalfa, you can't overseed with alfalfa.
Yes,
is that true?
Right. Alfalfa is not a super common pasture species that we would be talking about. But yes, if you have alfalfa, alfalfa does have autotoxicity issues. So that would be a concern, but there's a lot of grass species that you would be able to seed in. The big key, you can do legumes too, right? You could frost seed something like red clover if you don't have other weed issues that would, you'd have to kill the red clover in order to take care of. You could do bird's foot truffle. I mean, there's just all kinds of species that you can do depending on what your needs are and what you like to see in your
And how much
pasture.
tillage do you have to do to overseed?
Well,
What do you need to do to prepare this if you want to overseed it?
Yeah, if you're going to, so there's a couple things that we can do. So there's the frost seeding, which would be what we might do with legume species. So that's going to happen typically in late February, early March.
Okay.
Don't necessarily need to do tillage in advance of that, but the better seed soil contact we can get, the more likely we're going to have good establishment. So if we can do even just like a no-till drill that's going to scratch the surface, the big key in any scenario is the preparation that you go to in order to make sure that's successful. So I want to make sure that the fall before I'm intending on coming in and doing something like interseeding or frost seeding, that I have either grazed down or cut down the pasture, and I've sort of handicapped it going into winter. Right, so when we've been really droughty, that's usually a pretty darn good time to come back in, because like Chris talked about, when we came out and looked at one of the pastures over here, it looked like a lawn in October, right? And so that's basically an ideal situation where you've got a lot of open ground, everything's cut down really short, and so we want to make sure that it's going to be slow to green up that next spring in order to give whatever you come back in and seed as good a chance as possible. But no-till drills or broadcast seeding and then doing something like a harrow or rolling over it to give it better seed soil contact, those are good options to attempt the seeding.
What I've done at home is, like you said, say this pasture's mine at home. I'd run cows on it one last time here and let them nub it down pretty good. And then I'll go out and I'll frost seed in February. I get busy teaching classes, so it's usually late March, later than I'd like. But I go out with clover. Red clover is really good at frost seeding. And then what I'll do is I'll go out and after I frost seed it, I'll maybe run cows on it for just a short amount of time so that their feet maybe are working it in. Not a lot of time, but then take them right back off of it, and then probably most importantly, give it time to work. And these practices definitely take time too, because that first year that I did that, sure, I saw some clover out there, but I didn't really start seeing it big time until that second year. And you walk out and there's clover out there now, and I noticed that at home. But clovers and legumes seem to do the best at frost seeding. I've never had any good luck with grasses. They don't seem to frost seed at all.
Yeah.
I tried it, but I tried it.
Grasses don't handle cold weather very well. They don't overwinter very well, so it's really the legumes that we like to look at. That can actually help the legumes as far as doing things like breaking dormancy or hard-seededness. And I love the idea of running the cattle on it to get it kind of stomped into the ground, and then pulling them off and giving it rest and letting that species get a chance to get established. That's one of the biggest issues that we run into, is that you really need to be you need to have enough pasture available or enough feed available that you can allow your, the changes that you're making to be successful. So you got to be able to pull the livestock off in order to allow those plants to get established. Otherwise, right, cattle, any species is going to come out and they'll just be able to either,
It's a buffet.
yank things right out of the ground, right, cut them right off and eliminate their nice photosynthetic material that's going to keep them growing, and we don't want that to happen.
A couple quick things. I would agree 100% with red clover. It seems to be one of the easiest to establish, kind of the most forgiving.
Yep.
Seems to work well for frost seeding and introducing legume. I was thinking about your question on your new seeded area. So, and you very well may have done this, but one thing we'll do sometimes, and Megan can probably add some thoughts to this, but incorporate in whatever mix you're seeding something that's going to come up really fast and be kind of a nurse crop. And maybe it's not a long-lasting crop, maybe in some fall seedings it's oats or something like that, but
in most cases it's really short.
yeah, just something to kind of come up quick and take up that space so that the weeds don't jump in there. Okay.
And a lot of pasture mixes will have something like an annual ryegrass or a perennial ryegrass that are going to be, those two species in particular, along with oats, are going to be quick germinators, and they're relatively short-lived in the whole lifetime of a pasture. And so those are going to be ones to give you some of that quick cover and help hopefully crowd out weeds. So that evaluation of the pasture, I think, is really the starting place. If we don't know whether we need to make changes or we think we might need to, that's really where we want to start, is by going out and trying to be as objective as possible, because pastures vary dramatically, right? That's one of the things. If somebody calls me about a soybean field, I can ask them some questions. I got a pretty good idea of what that bean field looks like after I'm done with the conversation. But pastures, it's they just look so different, and they can be managed so differently, that really that as objective an evaluation as we can start with is important. And then there's a pretty standard protocol, right, if we want to make changes to pastures, right? So whether we're gonna do something like an interseeding or a frost seeding, whether we think we need a complete renovation, a lot of it starts in that same place with the evaluation. And then what you guys have done, and what I tell pretty much everybody to, is if you have never soil sampled your pasture, and you're looking to make changes, that's really where we need to start, because you don't know where you are until you look at what the baseline is, right? So we don't know whether the pasture's not doing well because the pH is so low that it's not supporting any species, or whether you've just driven down potassium levels or something so low. So that's really where we always want to start, and you guys did that this
spring. In
this
September,
spring.
I teach this fundamentals of soil science class, and the very first lab we had out here, we had Pinnacle, and again we talk about precision ag as well, and we kind of get the luxury of being able to come out. And I probably wouldn't have come out and done all grid sampling if these were my pastures, but we had the opportunity to bring somebody out and talk about how to grid sample, and they grid sampled these for for the samples, and then we've got the recommendations and reports back. So we did that right there. Would have been that would have been the first week of September. First week of September. So.
And the challenge we have management-wise, again, this is a 150-year-old facility, and they may have switched managers every 4 years, and that's why our cow herd looks the way it does, is because there's about 7 different breeds represented. So think about that in a pasture management setting. And so that does create challenges too, because as you know, if you have weeds, you build that seed bank in the soil, and now you're fighting weeds, And so that's some challenges that we have as well, is there's just been so many managers over the years too.
So our recommendation, when you guys came out, was we needed a baseline. Where do we start? And, to decide why do we have problems, and that's kind of where we made our decision to let's get it all sampled and get everybody on the same page, and then go from there.
Yeah, and so traditionally soil samples, we would advise that a soil sample never make up more than, or never represent more than 10 acres. But in a lot of cases in pastures, because they are managed differently on much smaller scales than 10 acres, oftentimes we're breaking these pastures up into just maybe a couple acre sections. So we're not maybe intentionally grid sampling, but because of past management, we want to make sure that things that are managed similarly are sampled together, right? And so in your guys' case, you had a lot of samples, but this area was sampled together, and then this one right here,
They
right?
were sampled by paddock.
Yeah, sampled by paddock. And so we got the results back on this one right here. And honestly, fertility in this area is fantastic. So if you had the results, organic matter is fairly low, right? 2.9%, which is what we expect for higher elevation ground. There's probably, it was probably managed differently in the past, and there's probably been erosion, right? We've lost some of that nice organic matter, and I believe pretty much all of it ended up over here, because that one is 5.6% organic matter. So we know where it went, at least. It didn't move far. Phosphorus levels, there are, I believe the Boosting Pasture Production document has the interpretations for some of these numbers, but the phosphorus level was 60 parts per million, which is extremely high, right? So no phosphorus needed to be added to this pasture. Potassium level was 243. Also, that would be in the high or very high range, probably. And then the pH was 7 in this particular one, which is perfectly neutral, right? That's ideal, right? That's right about where we want to be. For most pastures in central Iowa, as we get out of the Des Moines lobe, we maybe would want them to be a little bit higher, but typically 6.5, depending on what your subsoil is like. If you have alfalfa, it does need to be higher. We look at more of like a 6.9 pH to support alfalfa, because it does need that higher pH. It prefers those more neutral conditions. And so we never would have known this, right? Wouldn't have had any idea had we not sampled. So the nice thing was that they were able to come out and do this. And sampling is really something pretty easy that you can do on your own. I can't do it right now. Unable to push on the rib cage like I used to. But for it's something that you can do yourself. Most county extension offices have a soil probe that would be similar to this that you can actually borrow for free. They'll usually ask for some kind of collateral, like you write a little check, and then they'll give the check back to you when you bring the probe back. Because these will run anywhere from $80 to maybe a couple $100, depending on what kind of probe you get. So if you really are into this, you can buy one yourself. But for the probe is really nice. You can use a trowel as well, but the probe's really nice because you get a very consistent sample. And you can do something like mark the interior of this or the back of this with a permanent marker, so that you make sure you're getting a consistent depth on your sample. So pastures should be sampled to a 2 to 3 inch depth, unless you are going to be doing some kind of renovation where you will do tillage to a deeper depth than that, right? We don't want to come out and soil sample to 2 inches and then flip 6 inches of soil over, right? And now you have new soil on top of the ground that you don't know what the fertility is like in that. So each individual soil part, can you push this in 2 to 3 inches for me?
I thought you'd walk over there a few steps.
Yeah, actually right here would be really good, Chris. So each, yeah, so obviously when we are in drier conditions, it's very difficult to sample. Yeah, 2 to 3 inches or 6 inches. So basically I'll take this, right? So this is actually just about perfect conditions to sample in. And so Chris got a really good sample. So when we are taking these individual cores, we want to get a consistent depth on them. And you want to have a core that kind of sticks together, right? When we're too dry, if you stick that probe in the ground, if you can even get it in 2 to 3 inches, but you pull it out and it's just powder and it falls apart, right? That's not a good time to be sampling. That can mess with our results that we're actually getting. And then of course, if it's too wet, one of the challenges is that you can't break it up in order to mix the cores together. So like I said, a sample shouldn't make up more than 10 acres, and then for every sample we want to take, I would have Chris go out and I want him to get 12 to 15 cores that will make up that sample, right? 12 to 15 cores, we mix them together. You can put them in just about anything, right? This is way bigger than we need, but a nicely labeled bag. Ziploc bag works really well. And so when you're sending samples in, for every sample you'd have maybe a cup or a cup and a half of soil and send that to a lab. There's a lot of labs, some even within the state of Iowa that we can send it to, that are certified by the Iowa Department of Ag and Land Stewardship, and they'll turn around results typically in 7 to 10 days. So actually, it's not too late right now. This is a great time of year to do it, either in the fall or in the spring, and it's not too late yet to get out and do it. Now, when the ground freezes, it's then too late. So then we can stop when the ground's frozen. But it's still a good time to do it, and it's a great time of year to make some of these, or start the process of maybe making some of these changes that we might want to make and figuring out our baseline. And so soil sampling and figuring out whether we need to add some fertilizer, phosphorus, potassium, or liming our pastures, right? We can start doing that now, and we could even make those applications yet this year or next spring. And then kind of while this is all going on, this time of year is also a good time of year to do weed control. We're getting a little late now, but we haven't really had too many hard freezes. I mean, even if I look over here, we've got a nice little patch of Canada thistle, and it still looks like it's in pretty good condition. And so that's one of the biggest things, is if we're going to be treating weeds, we just want to make sure that the tissue is in good enough condition that when we spray them, it's actually going to take up the herbicide. So, I don't know if we want to walk around a little bit before we lose all of our light. Any questions about soil sampling, testing, anything?
Do you guys ever recommend like a fall just to winterize it? That's what my dad used.
Typically I'd call it more of like a late summer, right? Like a late August, early September kind of application.
Give it some time to build up some carbohydrates.
Right. So there's a few different philosophies with nitrogen management, right? Nitrogen management is typically the fertilizer that you're going to get your biggest bang for your buck with, right? Because it's going to be producing green leafy material for your livestock to feed on. And that's the one that a soil test is not going to tell us how much nitrogen we need. So we have more of a standard rate depending on what your practices are and what kind of species you have out in your pasture. And like Chris said, if you do have at least 30% legume, that legume is typically providing enough nitrogen that you don't need to supplement with synthetic nitrogen. But a lot of pastures don't have that, or if they do, it's in spots, right? So spotty legumes as opposed to having a really nice consistent stand of a grass legume mix. And so there's a few different philosophies, and the Boosting Pasture Production publication that we brought along describes them more in depth and some of the rates. But really it's the idea of applying once a year in the spring, in kind of late March or early April, supporting that pasture when you're getting the most growth out of the pasture anyway, right? So you're giving it the nitrogen right before it's going to really take off for the year. Or for more intensively managed pastures, you would consider splitting it up. And so that could be either kind of a 2 application thing or a 3 application thing. With 2 applications, again, supporting it right ahead of those high growth periods. So late March, early April, and then again hitting it in like late August, early September before we get some of that nice fall growth. There are folks who will do a 3 application, really intensive management, where they're coming back maybe in early June and applying a part of that fertilizer again and trying to extend that grazing period maybe a little further into the summer than we normally would get with some of these cool season species that we're dealing with, right? So just trying to take that summer slump and push it back maybe a few weeks by doing that. And so it really depends on your philosophy, how intensively you manage the pasture, and what kind of shape it's in. Because the other thing about the nitrogen is that the fertilizer is going to support weeds in pretty much the same way it supports your pasture species. So if you have a lot of weeds in your pasture, or you're going to come in with an early June application and your grass isn't doing well to begin with, you are giving an upper hand to any weed species that may be out there, right? Because they're going to take up that nitrogen. That's another reason why if you're going to make a big, like a renovation, or you're going to be interseeding something like grass, we would typically advise that you maybe hold off on that nitrogen application until whatever your new species is established, because it's not going to take advantage of that nitrogen. Your grass that's already present and your weeds are going to be able to use it a lot faster than a newly germinating seedling is.
I wonder if you guys are interested at all, if maybe we could just walk around a little bit.
Yeah.
You can play around with the pasture condition scoring thing if you want. We can maybe look at some different species and play around with species identification, or, you know, make it a little more active here before the sun goes down.
Yes.
Corias are causing various problems in cattle, and it's also a pretty hardy, pretty productive grass. It's very common in southern Iowa. We're starting to see a little more and more of it moving north, it seems like, but it has an endophyte in it, which is basically a little fungus that produces alkaloids, and those are compounds that cause the blood vessels to constrict in the cattle, and so they tend to not dissipate heat quite as well. So they have some heat stress issues, they have some problems with their feet, especially in distal extremities, so feet, tails, switches, things like that. They sometimes don't get enough blood flow to those extremities when the blood vessels constrict like they do. Because of the heat stress, we see some issues with reproductive problems and just not breeding up like we'd like.
Is that you're referring to?
It's called tall fescue. So, yep. And there's some different varieties of fescue now that have been developed commercially. Typically, when I say tall fescue, we're talking about Kentucky 31. That's the classic old variety. And if you didn't seed, like if you have fescue and you didn't purposely seed one of the new varieties, you've probably got Kentucky 31. It's just really common in road ditches and in various pastures and stuff across the country. But so we do struggle with that one sometimes, balancing how to manage it. Over the last few years, the state of Missouri has actually kind of been big on total pasture renovation, where they come in and try to renovate, get rid of the tall fescue and come in with other species or other varieties of fescue. I would say that's going to be kind of a daunting and possibly expensive task. It can be managed. One of the ways is to incorporate other species of grass and legumes and stuff to dilute it out.
For example, what other species of grass are you referring to?
Brome, orchard, timothy,
Okay.
Any of those good productive cool
Any of
seasons.
those that you would have in your hayfield?
Yep. And if you've got weeds under control and stuff, maybe coming in with some red clover or something like that can help. There's, I've seen folks actually go to some fall calving because they could then avoid some of the reproductive issues on their fescue pastures that they have in the summertime. So there's a lot of give and take there. You can supplement to kind of help dilute it out and things too, but it's one that we talk a lot about, especially as we go further south, how to manage it and live with it and stuff like that.
We keep talking about it being in southern Iowa, but it's all over the place, so we got it.
Was that tall fescue?
This is
Yep, that's tall fescue.
We were just talking. We've lost two bulls, not lost two bulls, but lost the productivity on two bulls out here because of fescue. So we had an Angus bull 5 or 6 years ago, it was textbook. You know, the hooves were separating from the bone. I mean, and then the tails were short, and we had to get rid of that one. And then we've got a Charolais bull. Is he getting better? Or? Not limping, but he's gone backwards twice now on us. And
So this is vasoconstriction.
yes, yep. And he's kind of a little bit too. His hooves are just kind of weird, like there's something wrong there, and so that's probably what we're going to attribute that to as well, because those Charolais bulls came out of a different environment, so they may or may not be better suited to, selecting for livestock. I think it used to be that you want to maybe select, and I think that's big in Missouri too, is make sure those cattle that you're getting can handle that stuff.
That's actually a great point. So we've known for a long time, if we're in the fescue belt, cattle that are developed here and grown here tend to tolerate that grass more so than from other parts of the country. So it's common to talk about buying cattle from other parts of the country, maybe from the west, and we bring them in and they really struggle that first season. They don't breed up like we'd like because they're just not adapted to it. Essentially in the fescue belt over the years we've naturally culled the ones that aren't adapted to it, right? But actually in Missouri there's a company that's been developed through some professors from the University of Missouri, where they do genetic tests for sensitivity to fescue toxicosis and resistance to it. I'm not sure exactly what their status is right now. I know a couple years ago they were really pushing that and working on validating the tests and stuff, and it seemed really promising, but I haven't heard much about it in probably the last 2 years. But, yeah.
10 inches tall, which may be like 6 or more times in a growing season.
Right.
You could, you should see it be less competitive. I don't know whether you could get rid of it completely, and some of that has to do with whether or not it's coming in from another area, right? So if it's on like the edge of a pasture and it's coming in from a road ditch, right?
You're never going to get rid of it.
you could mow all day every day.
Yeah.
You'll never get rid of it because it'll keep trying to come in. But it would be effective in suppressing it at least. So here we've got a pretty massive patch of Canada thistle. So Canada thistle is our perennial thistle here in Iowa. It's the original noxious weed. So it's actually the reason that the noxious weed law was created. And so you can see that it spans a fairly large area out here in this pasture. And because it's a perennial, so this is actually a creeping perennial, so we can think of perennials in a couple different ways. There are perennials like dandelion, right? Dandelion has a taproot. The only way it's moving around and starting new plants is by spreading seed to different areas. Canada thistle's different. For as much Canada thistle as you see above ground, there's probably 5 or 10 times as much below ground in the form of basically a lateral root system. So basically these will go down in the ground and then eventually they'll make a left or right turn, and what you would see below ground would be a huge network of growth that's supporting the production of new little stems coming up all over the place. And so this could actually be like one plant, just all interconnected beneath the ground. And so Canada thistle's really one of the species, one of a handful of species that I would say is virtually impossible to control without herbicides. And it's really challenging, especially if you have Canada thistle that's coming in from somewhere else, right? So if you have a pasture and it's, this is a nice little patch, it looks like it's all pretty well contained within this pasture, that tells me that they could probably get control of this with kind of an intensive management program with some herbicide applications once a year for maybe 3 to 4 years, hopefully, perhaps longer, because that is that's a lot of Canada thistle out there. But if it's coming in from somewhere else, there's only so much you can do, right? Because it's, you can control it on your property line, but it's always going to come in from the neighbors unless they control it also. And so, again, like I said, it's all about kind of the condition of the plants, but fall is the best time of year to control it. Unfortunately, the tough thing about this species is that our typical herbicides that we use, like 2,4-D and dicamba, that we might spray on a grass pasture, that are going to have very short intervals to being able to do things like replant other species or even haying out in an area, those are not going to be nearly as effective as some of what I would call more of like our heavy hammer kind of herbicides. And so this, I would say, if you've got a problem with Canada thistle, typically warrants more of the nuclear type approach with a little bit of a heavier hammer product. But those products typically come with something like an 18-month interval to haying. And it's very important that people remember that. Because we need to be very cautious if we've got livestock out on that pasture and we move them somewhere where they're producing manure that we might use for something, or if we get in that situation where we get one of those great springs and we get more growth than we expect, and we're like, yeah, we'll just hay that, right? We don't need all that grass, we're just going to hay it and then we'll have some stuff for winter. Absolutely cannot do that if we've used one of these tougher products to try to manage our Canada thistle, because it does really bad things to all kinds of crops that are going to be sensitive to those products. So typically we would advise using a product called aminopyrrolid that's available as a couple different commercial product names. Grazon Next, HL's one, and then so that has 2,4-D in it, and then Milestone is the other name that I'm aware of. There might be some more, but that is a very effective product. The second best time of year that we typically would try to treat these would be late spring, right about the time when it has buds and maybe a few of the plants are starting to produce a flower. We would call that like the second best time of year. If you can't catch them in the fall in like October, second best time of year would be to come back when they've grown up and they're starting to produce those buds and maybe you're seeing a flower or two. That usually happens like the first week in June. So most of the time, you know, if you've got row crop ground, you're not going to call me and tell me that you'll be out there the first week in June to spray. So unfortunately, the second best time is harvest, or the best time is harvest. Second best time is spray season. Any questions?
Looking at a spot like this, is this a basic treatment, or are you calling a nuclear strike on something like this?
So you guys have been doing spot spraying. When I look at this area, this is like the kind of area where I think stick some flags out at the corners of the patch, broadcast spray the whole thing, right? It's not going to be worth coming around trying to treat every stem of Canada thistle in this area with how much Canada thistle there is. Yeah, any legumes in here I would be willing to sacrifice in order to get rid of this, because this is a big problem.
Over the years, it moves there, and then it moves there, and then it moves there, and so it's been a fun little patch to chase, and now it's getting bigger.
A little patch to chase. Yep.
So if it's ineffective, you spray a plant, why doesn't it throw that herbicide?
It will. So that's why fall's the time of year that we want to treat. Because naturally this time of year, what are they doing? Well, they're maybe photosynthesizing a little bit, but they're sending energy down underground so that they can survive the winter. And so if we treat in the fall, we're sort of naturally following the process of where everything else in the plant is going, and it's down into that root system. Whereas during the spring, if we come back and treat, what's the plant doing? Well, it's sending all the energy up from the roots. So it's much harder to get a more thorough kill if we treat Canada thistle in the spring than in the fall. And that's the same for a lot of biennials and perennials. And so it does, but like I said, for what you see, you know, there is much more below ground. So, you know, I talk to people who tell me that they've been fighting Canada thistle on, you know, in their pastures for decades. And so that's why this more kind of nuclear approach is something that's typically going to be more effective, but still going to be a multi-year thing, because we can't just expect to spray it once and be done and never see it again.
So So how long do you have to leave your livestock? I mean, how long can you not use this paddock then?
So the grazing restrictions, typically most herbicides, the grazing restrictions are going to apply only to like lactating dairy animals. So if you just have beef cattle, most products that you would use would have basically a 0-day interval to grazing. So you can bring them back out here, but you would need to have a rest period before you move them to some place where there's going to be a sensitive species if you want to save that sensitive species. So they would need to be moved for like 3 days to something else before you would move them. Maybe someplace with like a lot of alfalfa or something. Does that make sense? And that's regardless of how long ago you sprayed, as long as it's within that 18-month time frame on the labels.
So that 3-day break to let them clear the product.
So you're talking about a 3-day withdrawal?
Yeah. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
Essentially.
And it's the number of days depends on what product it is, right? But that's why we all got to read our herbicide labels.
Yeah, the label will tell you those details, and like the haying restriction, and correct me if I'm wrong, but it's mostly because we're worried about if we were to feed that or roll it out somewhere where there are other sensitive species. So a classic example is feeding bales of that kind of hay that's been treated on corn stalk residue, and then corn doesn't grow there the next season, right? That's kind of where that restriction comes from.
Yeah. So the grazing, there's typically no grazing restrictions, or they're very short, like I said, unless you have dairy animals. The restriction comes in from the haying or using manure from livestock that are feeding on a pasture that's been sprayed with this. And I have some really fabulous photos, if anybody wants to see them, of what happens when you accidentally forget that you have applied one of these long-lived plant growth regulators, hay the ground, and then put it out on, like Chris said, corn stalks, and plant beans the next year. It's not a good deal.
But it's not going to kill the cattle that
No.
come back in and graze it?
No.
Okay.
No. It's a concern from a sensitive plant species perspective.
And it shouldn't show up as residue in your livestock if you were to market them either. Right?
Yeah, if it has a 0-day grazing restriction, like I said, it's just if there's a withdrawal period on it.
Are these able to wall themselves off? You know, kind of like an animal that injured themselves, they kind of wall that period, that place off, and they kind of heal themselves. With them having the underground modifications there, the rhizomes, are they able to wall off? If you smoke this plant and it's all the same plant, can they wall off so that herbicide doesn't go? Maybe not this time of year, but when you talk about going into the springtime where it's doing the opposite, does it have to?
I would speculate that there's probably some of that kind of thing that happens, especially because with plant growth regulators, we always tell people that you need to be careful and follow the label with regard to rate, because if you apply too high of rates, you essentially can cause the plant to just shut down, right? And then it's just not going to translocate anything, right? You just dump a whole bunch of product on it, right? You may kill that individual stem, but yeah, it's much less likely to translocate.
My dad used to send me out with a spade, and he never told me about.
Particular species. There's a really beautiful picture from Colorado State where I think they put like a couple, like 2-inch underground sections. I've heard them. So lots of species have rhizomes, which are underground stems. I've heard these referred to as rhizomes, but I've also heard them referred to as just a rootstock. But they put a couple 2-inch sections in like this large box, filled it with soil, planted them, and then I think it was either 1 or 2 years later they pulled off the wall of it and washed out all the soil, and it was like just pure roots. I mean, there was just nothing there but roots. And of course the plants above ground are only this tall, and they're all contained within this like 1 by 6 foot area. So it seems like if a pasture's overgrazed, it's always You know, in those areas, if it's got something good out there, it's Kentucky bluegrass and
then it
white
compacts
clover.
it, yeah.
So this, you can tell, is obviously some kind of old traffic path here. And so like I said, as far as the weed control and weed issues, one of the important things is to differentiate between whether you've got annual weed problems or perennial weed problems, or biennial weeds. Because biennial and perennial, you're going to have to manage totally differently. And I, of course, ran right into this species, buffalo burr, with my leg. And so that's nasty, right? A lot of times we get these species that are covered in spines in pastures and feedlots because livestock won't touch them, because they're much smarter than that, unlike me. And that's why they're able to persist. And so oftentimes that's an indication of, right, compaction, overgrazing, or just open space where those annuals are able to come in. Because when we think about when they come up, it's typically going to be May and maybe June, which is going to be much later than when our pasture species should be growing, right? And so when we think of the ground being open at the time, open enough for them to get sunlight and germinate, that's a sign that there's something going on with the pasture that maybe needs to be remedied. Or maybe it's something that you can't control, right? And so it's just something to think about, right? We've got the buffalo burr here, and here we've got looks like a red root pigweed species, which is another annual, but you can just kind of see along here there's a lot of seed heads and stuff from some different annual species out here. Whereas as soon as you get off of that, right, you don't see nearly as many of the seed heads because we've gotten out of that area where the annuals are.